Okay, so let's talk about the Special Air Service, the Australian SAS, and the Brereton Report, because that's come out recently. And unfortunately, it's a report that suggests that there's been some very undesirable practices on the part of the SAS in the past. And there was about a 5-year period there where, there was a lack of discipline and oversight, and some quite improper activity happened. Now, obviously, this has got to go through the courts, so we have to be mindful of that. There's been no legal action yet. There's been no charges laid, so on and so forth. But it's well accepted that wrongdoing did go on, and the army's moved to, I think, strike one of the squadrons, I think the second squadron, from the army roll, and they're considering citations and potentially medals and a whole range of other things. The Brereton Report did seem to exonerate the upper ranks. But look, before we get into that, let's talk about where the SAS came from, because there's always been special operations and sort of special commando units, that sort of thing, been used for hundreds of years. But in the Second World War, in the desert, there was something that grew up called the Long Range Driving Group, the LRDG, that the British had. And as I recall, I think it was run and set up by a chap called Woodhouse. I think he was Woodhouse, a man of that name, was essentially heavily involved in its inception. Anyway, over time after the Second World War, it became its own regiment, the Special Air Service, and we now have one here in Australia. And they really are serious fighters. They're ready for a fight. In many ways, modern armies, to the extent that they can use these special forces, really can soften up an opposition and cause havoc and mayhem for an enemy, because they are so determined and so ready for a fight. And they can be put through quite harsh circumstances and remain a very effective fighting force, specialising in operations behind enemy lines, and really causing havoc when the enemy isn't expecting it, so turning up at sort of airports in the middle of the night and blowing up enemy planes and enemy supplies, and basically really disrupting supply lines and disrupting the enemy's underbelly as they try to supply their front. So it's very effective for a modern army to have a special air service, a special operations service, and it's certainly something that the army relies on. So I suppose the issue becomes, well, we can wait for more reports, we can wait for prosecutions, but can we say anything to explain the situation and understand it a bit better? And I would say, yes, we can say something quite important right now, and that is, you should not send out an armed mission, whether it be a reconnaissance mission or a combat mission, but any armed mission of the SAS should be led by an officer, a lieutenant, or even a captain if necessary. It should not be left to non-commissioned officers, so lance corporals or sergeants, that sort of thing. It has to be an officer, and that officer can be called on by the head of the regiment, the colonel of the regiment, who of course can be called on by the chief of the army or chief of the defence force. So you have to have that chain of command there. Now, if we have developed in a different way in Australia, then I think that's a huge mistake. If if it's the view that, well, we can't have an officer in charge because that would cost too much, well, bad luck. Employ more officers. If it's, well, that's not how we've done it in the past, doesn't matter. This regiment is not hundreds and hundreds of years old. It's not perfected yet. An officer really has to be in charge. Is that a silver bullet or a panacea? No, it's not. But I think it would have a greatly beneficial effect to have an officer in charge as the in-theatre officer of these armed missions, reconnaissance or combat. Not just a officer flying the helicopter or back at base, but actually leading the troop in the field on these armed missions, because they do have such a destructive capability. You have to have an officer in charge as a minimum, and I suspect that would have greatly helped the SAS in the past in Australia, and I think it would greatly help the SAS in the future in Australia to have an officer in charge of these armed mission, reconnaissance or combat.